Well, it has, I believe, fallen into place. And so now I feel comfortable enough telling you what it is. Some of you may recall the name of Hugh Fulford. Hugh was a preacher who preached for this congregation some years ago when they were meeting at Allen and Edgewood. And he organized a segment at the Polishing the Pulpit workshop that he called the greatest sermons of the last 200 years. And the purpose of that segment was to have some of our gospel preachers go back and pull out the sermons from men like N.B. Hardeman and G.C. Brewer and other Gus Nichols and others who have just done some of the really memorable, timeless sermons through the last couple of centuries. Well, I attended a segment of that a couple of years ago, and I got to hear Brother Alan Hires deliver a sermon that was by Brother G.C. Brewer on the 23rd Psalm. And I thought it was one of the most beautiful sermons I have ever heard in my life. And so when I was thinking about putting this class together, I really wanted you to get to hear that sermon. And just last night, Brother Hires called me and confirmed that he is willing to do that. And I've talked to a couple of the other teachers, and I think the tentative plan right now is to combine our class and Jason Jackson's class, which I didn't know is also studying Psalms, and David Looney's class on June the 1st in the auditorium. And Brother Hires is going to deliver the 23rd Psalm that evening. And I think you are in for a real treat. When he delivered it at Polishing the Pulpit, by the time he was done, I don't think there was a dry eye in the room. It is truly beautiful. So you're in for a treat June the 1st. Try to be here. Bring someone with you. I think it'll be something really memorable. I'm very excited about it. In the meantime, however, we have 2 weeks, and I thought this would be a good time for us to take up a series of 4 Psalms. We'll try to do them 2 per week that relate to the time following David's sin with Bathsheba. We believe there are 4 Psalms that he wrote in the aftermath of that whole scenario that really lay out the process of recovering after sin. And they're very poignant Psalms. And the Psalms are Psalm 6, Psalm 38, Psalm 51, and Psalm 32, I believe in that order. I can't be dogmatic about that. Of course, we don't know what order David wrote the Psalms. But that seems to give a progression of recovery after David's sin with Bathsheba. Now, the background of that, of course, is from 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. And just by way of a brief orientation, remember, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, Samuel relates to us that in the spring of the year, the kings were accustomed to go out to battle. And David sent Joab, the captain of his armies, and the armies of Israel and Judah into battle against the Ammonites, but David himself did not go. And that's unusual. It's unusual in terms of a king not leading his armies in battle, but it's especially unusual for David, whose reputation was forged in battle. I mean, he was not unacquainted with war, and he was a mighty warrior, but he chose to stay home, and we suggest there that he had shirked his duty by staying home and sending the armies and not leading the armies himself. And while he was there, you recall, he walked on the roof of his palace, and he looked out and he saw a woman bathing, and he called her to his palace and committed adultery with her. And when he sleeps with Bathsheba, of course, she conceives a child. And then David begins to try and cover it up. She was married to Uriah the Hittite, who was out serving David faithfully, fighting the war. And so David writes a letter to Joab and has Uriah sent back to Jerusalem. And he attempts to persuade Uriah to go home and be with his wife, thinking that Uriah will be fooled into believing the child is his own. But Uriah won't do it. He won't go home. He sleeps on the steps of David's palace. And when David calls him in the next day and questions him about it, he says, "How can I go home and eat and be with my wife while the soldiers of Israel are camped in the field and they're living on field rations, if you will, and they're fighting. And so the next night, David tried to get him drunk, thinking that if he could just get him drunk, he would go on home and sleep with his wife and think that the child was his. But Uriah, even in his inebriated state, sleeps on the palace steps again. And so finally, David writes a letter to Joab, and he says, I want you to put Uriah at the front of the battle, and when the battle is really hot and raging, I want you to withdraw and allow Uriah to be killed. And he sends that letter in Uriah's hand to Joab. So Uriah carries his own death warrant to the captain of the army, and of course Uriah was killed. And then in chapter 12, we learn that the Lord sent his prophet Nathan to confront David. And Nathan did as Jesus and others of the great teachers did. He began with a parable. He told a story about a man who had one little ewe lamb, and he said that man was very poor, but that little lamb was like a member of the family, and it slept with his family, and it ate with his family, and it was just like a member of the family. But he had a rich neighbor who had flocks and herds plenty, and when he wanted to have a banquet for a guest, rather than taking from among his flocks and herds, he went and took his neighbor's one little ewe lamb, and he slaughtered it and served it to his guest. And he said, what do you think about that, David? And 2 Samuel 12 says David's anger waxed hot. And he said, the man that has done this deserves to die, and he shall repay him fourfold. That, of course, is when Nathan looks David in the eye and says, thou art the man. And at that point, David says, I have sinned, but Nathan goes on to tell him, there's a terrible price to pay for your sin. And of course, that child that was the product of David's relationship with Bathsheba dies as a consequence of David's sin. And furthermore, David's house is rent asunder with violence from that point forward. As a matter of fact, in the very next chapter, you begin to see some of the cracks forming in David's house, and then from there to the time of David's death, it's just one catastrophe after another from within his household. But David has to deal with this sin. And what I want us to see from this series of studies is not so much that David sinned, but that David recovered from sin, and how David got from being completely immersed in guilt to a point where he was once again the man after God's own heart. Because the fact is, every one of us has sinned. And the fact is, every one of us, if we live long enough, are going to do something that is going to make us feel like we have just absolutely, completely blown it. And make us really wonder, is there any coming back from this? And I think that's where David was. And I think it's worth our time to study and see how David grapples with this and recovers from where he was in the blackness of sin to the point that we get to at the end of Psalm 32, where David is assured that he has been forgiven and restored. And hopefully this study will be of benefit to you. I want to notice quickly before we get into the text sort of the progression of this sin, because you have the initial sin that he commits with Bathsheba, and then you have the cover-up, where he tries to persuade Uriah to go and do things that will make him think that it's his child. And then when that won't work, he has Uriah killed to cover up his guilt. And then you have the confrontation, where Nathan confronts David with his sin. At that point, David kind of seems to wake up. And I'll be honest with you, in my younger years, especially growing up in Sunday school when we would study this, I didn't really get how David didn't know what he was doing was wrong. And I don't mean that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. But as I've gotten older, I've seen from personal experience and the experience of others how sometimes you get caught up in a course of action and it doesn't really come to your realization what all you're involved in until something happens to open your eyes. And I think when Nathan says, thou art the man in 2 Samuel 12, that was that moment when David finally realizes the full brunt of what he's done. I think prior to that, he's just sort of riding on instinct and emotion and not really thinking about and weighing what he's done. But he recognizes what he's done, and there's a great deal of sorrow toward the middle of 2 Samuel 12. But then this punishment comes into the picture, and there is a great deal of regret and dismay. Remember that while the baby was sick and dying, David wouldn't eat, and he wouldn't comb his hair, and he wouldn't wash his face, and he wept, and he prayed, and he begged, and he did everything that he could to try and convince God to spare the baby's life. But then when the baby died, David got up and washed his face, combed his hair, and he sat down and he ate a meal. And his servants didn't really know what to make of that. But David's journey through his recovery really wasn't done at that point. Because as we read these Psalms, we see that there was a literal physical sickness that accompanied this recovery. And then that sickness sort of gives way to a resolve to try and seek restoration and a repentance of the things that he's done, which ultimately leads to his restoration with God. Now, I want to be clear that even though David was restored, his sin was forgiven and his justification was restored to him, David had to deal with the consequences of his sin for the rest of his life. And sometimes that's the nature of sin, that we have to absorb and deal with consequences that flow from our sins, sometimes for the rest of our lives or for quite some time after we have repented of them and we've been absolved of the guilt of them. And that was David's situation. And so as we work through this, I want you to realize that here is a man who is realizing he's going to have to cope with the consequences of his sin, although he can be forgiven and wiped clean of that sin. That's a lot to grapple with. We begin in Psalm 6, which I've entitled Devastation. Because when you read Psalm 6, it's pretty obvious, I think, that David is just totally devastated at this point with the realization of what he's done. And in verses 1 through 5, David is begging God. And listen to the language here. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, nor chasten me in your hot displeasure. Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am weak. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are troubled. My soul also is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? Return, O Lord, deliver me. O save me for your mercy's sake, for in death there is no remembrance of you. In the grave, who will give you thanks? Now let's go back and look at verse 1 just a moment. David says twice here in different ways, don't rebuke me in your anger. Don't chasten me in your hot displeasure. There are two kinds of chastening that we read about in the Bible. There's the kind of chastening that the Hebrews writer alludes to in Hebrews chapter 12, when he talks about whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and every son that he receiveth, he scourgeth. It's the idea of discipline and correction and admonition and steering in the right direction, training. That's what we might call the chastening of love. And then there's the sort of chastening that is just plain punishment for wickedness. Achan and his household, who had to be stoned to death because he had taken the thing that was devoted to the Lord. Remember after the fall of Jericho? That sort of punishment for wrong. And David is here begging God, Lord, don't just punish me for what I've done. Which sort of assumes, doesn't it, that David's done something that deserves God's hot wrath. He's begging here for mercy. Although he's well aware that if justice is meted out, justice demands the hot wrath of God. And interestingly enough, the word in the Hebrew that's translated hot displeasure in the New King James literally has to do with the idea of heat, as though God had heated up a great fire in his anger. By the way, interestingly enough, when Nathan told the parable to David, Samuel records that David's wrath waxed hot, didn't he? While David wasn't realizing it was him that was being talked about, he was highly indignant at the behavior of this man who had stolen his neighbor's little ewe lamb. And then when he realized that it was about him, he's also well aware that God has the right to be hotly angry with him. But he's begging God not to be. And he says, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am weak." The idea here is, have you ever had a high fever and just felt like you didn't have the energy hardly to move your head from one shoulder to the other? That's sort of the sense of the word here, is as though he's sick and has the weakness that comes with real sickness, like you just don't have the energy to go. "O Lord, heal me, for my bones are troubled." The word here in Hebrew is actually the idea of my bones are affrighted. My bones are afraid. That sort of deep down fear of what you know is the just deserts of what you've done. David is absolutely devastated here. And he takes it another step further. Look at verse 3. "My soul also is greatly troubled." Now notice this. He's described himself sort of in three facets here. I am weak, my bones are affrighted, my soul is troubled. David is saying, I am just thoroughly dismayed with what I've done. To the point that I believe he's physically sick at this point. And then he finishes verse 3 with an incomplete thought. "But you, O Lord, how long?" And boy, the commentators have spilled a lot of ink on how long what. But I think that's just the point. David's at a point where he doesn't know what to say next. How long does this last? How long can I stand what I'm feeling? How long, Lord, will I not know if I can be forgiven? What? All of those things, and many more besides. In verse 4, he says, "Return, O Lord, deliver me. O save me for your mercy's sake, for in death there is no remembrance of you. In the grave, who will give you thanks?" David is saying to the Lord here, please don't let me die because of this. Now, by the way, what dispensation of God's dealings with man does David live under? The law of Moses, right? What's the penalty for adultery under the law of Moses? It's death by stoning of both parties. So when David is talking about death here, he knows very well what the law demands. Now, interestingly enough, he's preemptively killed the man who had standing to ensure that he was stoned, Uriah. You ever thought about that? But now he's confronted one greater than Uriah. And he knows that the Lord knows that he's guilty. And if the Lord wants him dead, he'll be dead. And so he is terrified at this point. In verse 6, he begins talking about weeping. "I'm weary with my groaning. All night I make my bed swim." Talk about some vivid poetry. David says, my bed is swimming with my tears. I can't sleep. I'm crying all night long because I realize what I've done. I drench my couch with my tears. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows old because of all my enemies. I don't know that David is necessarily there talking about literal human enemies there, as much as his troubles, his problems. I know one thing, this reference to growing old and tying it to the concept of grief is something that's borne out by experience. I've seen, and you have too, people that seem to age overnight because of grief. Perhaps the loss of a husband or a wife after many years, and the surviving spouse just seems in a very short time to have physically aged a great deal. You've probably seen it, I have, and you can probably think of people in particular who've gone through that. And David is grieving here over his sin, and he's aging. He even mentions he's growing old because of this. Then, beginning in verse 8, there's just the faintest glimmer of hope. And one of the things I think you're going to see as we work our way through these 4 Psalms is that this sort of dim glimmer of hope that we run across in Psalm 6 gets gradually brighter and brighter as we progress through these 4 Psalms. But listen to how David describes it beginning in verse 8. Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity, for the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping. The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord will receive my prayer. Let all my enemies be ashamed and greatly troubled. Let them turn back and be ashamed suddenly. David is pretty confident here that the Lord has heard him. What it doesn't appear that he's quite as sure about here, as he will be in later Psalms, is that the Lord's going to grant his request. Here he just says he's heard me. He's heard my weeping. He's heard my prayer. He's heard my supplication. And he's hoping that the enemies will be ashamed and troubled. In later Psalms in this list, he's going to be much, much more confident in what the Lord is doing as a result of his prayers. All right? Any questions or comments on Psalm 6? Now let's turn to Psalm 38 and watch the progression as David moves from devastation into depression. There's a period of malaise and depression that David goes through before he really sort of turns the corner. It's as though he has to take time to grieve what he has done before he can begin to recover and return back to service. And Psalm 38 sort of describes that. Incidentally, you begin with almost the same language as Psalm 6, don't you? O Lord, do not rebuke me in your wrath, nor chasten me in your hot displeasure. Almost word for word what he said in Psalm 6. For your arrows pierce me deeply, and your hand presses me down. Now, there's no way of knowing as we stand here tonight at what stage in the development of these events David wrote any one of these Psalms. But it's not hard to imagine that Psalm 38 in particular may derive from the days surrounding the sickening and dying of his child, as he's experiencing the first of the consequences of his sin. Your arrows pierce me deeply. Your hand presses me down. Now look at this, because he's sick here. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your anger, nor any health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. They've gone over my head. I had an experience a couple of summers ago where I got in over my head, literally. I was kayaking on a river up in East Tennessee and flipped and had to come out of my kayak. And all was well as I was bumping down the river where I could touch bottom, but I couldn't seem to get out of the river. And then I just saw a point where I didn't see water anymore, and it was just sky. Now, thankfully, it wasn't a real high waterfall, about 4.5 feet. But what I didn't know was how deep the hole below it was. I'm wearing a life jacket now. But I went down, and I went down, and I went down, and I went down, and I could begin to feel that life jacket tugging me back up. But it seemed like it took forever to reach the surface. And when I finally broke the surface and got to the shore, some people that were standing around watching said, "We didn't know if you were ever coming up." And it felt like that. I didn't know how much water was between me and the air I could breathe, but it was a lot of it. And I'm not a real tall guy, but it was several times my height. And it took a while to get to the surface. Now, David is saying, my sin feels like it's that far over my head. I don't know when or if I'm ever going to break the surface again. I may stay down here and not ever recover. It's above my head. It's a burden that's too heavy for me. I can't carry this burden. Actually, that's as accurate as anything David ever wrote, isn't it? Sin literally is a burden too heavy for us. We can't carry it because it destroys us. It took God in the flesh to lift that burden off of our shoulders and take it away from us. And the burden he gives us back by comparison is easy and light, isn't it? But David said, this is too heavy for me. My wounds, listen to this language, how graphic it is. My wounds are foul and festering. Now, David's probably not physically wounded here, but his soul is. And he's describing here, it's almost as though his soul has gangrene. And he feels it dying within him. My wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness. How many times have we done something wrong and afterwards looked back and said, oh, I was such a fool. Why did I do that? How foolish I was. That's where David is at this point. Because of my foolishness, I'm troubled. I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long. For my loins are full of inflammation, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and severely broken. I groan because of the turmoil of my heart. Lord, all my desire is before you, and my sighing is not hidden from you. My heart pants, my strength fails me. As for the light of my eyes, it also has gone from me. David is physically sick over his sin. And I'm convinced he's not just being dramatic here. I think David is absolutely devastated with shame and guilt over what he's done. Realizing not only has he taken advantage of this woman, murdered her husband, but he abdicated his role as king. He should have been out there leading his armies in the first place. And he has let down God. He has let down the nation. Here he is, the king of the nation, guilty of a sin that ought to cause him to be stoned to death. How do you lead when people know that? And that's where David is. I believe he's totally overcome with the weight of his sin. Beginning in verse 11, he talks about the fact that he loses some relationships over this. He says, my loved ones and my friends stand aloof from my plague, and my relatives stand afar off. Those also who seek my life lay snares for me. Those who seek my hurt speak of destruction and plan deception all the day long. But I, like a deaf man, do not hear, and I am like a mute who does not open his mouth. Thus I am like a man who does not hear, and in whose mouth is no response. Now look at what David's saying here. First of all, he's saying a lot of the people that I was close to don't want anything to do with me. You know this already, but when you're really down and out, the people that come to you then, those are the true friends. Everybody's got friends when things are going well. And you can really tell who cares about you by seeing who comes to your aid when you're down. David's saying there are a lot of people that I thought were my friends that are hands off. They don't want to be sullied by being seen with me, whatever. They don't want any part in my suffering, whatever it may be. But they're backing away. And meanwhile, those who seek my heart, and you know a king like David had his enemies, well, they're plotting every which way to take advantage of the situation, to discredit him, to shame him, to weaken him in some way, to use it to their advantage. And David's well aware of that as well. But then in verses 13 and 14, he says essentially, I'm powerless to do anything about it. I can barely hear it. I can't respond to it. I can't do anything with it. I'm just like a man who can't hear or speak, a deaf mute. I have no answer for what's going on. Because at the end of the day, I think David realizes, are those people wrong to desert him? He's in the wrong. Are his enemies wrong to take advantage of it? Well, maybe, but he was wrong first. He gave it to them. He served it up on a silver platter for them. And he's well aware of that. He has no answer. But look at verses 15 through 22, because I think here is where we really begin to see a turn as this progress develops. In verse 15 he says, "For in you, O Lord, I hope. You will hear, O Lord my God. For I said, hear me, lest they rejoice over me, lest when my foot slips they exalt themselves against me. For I am ready to fall, and my sorrow is continually before me. For I will declare my iniquity, I will be in anguish over my sin. But my enemies are vigorous, and they are strong. And those who hate me wrongfully have multiplied. Those who render evil for good, they are my adversaries, because I follow what is good. Do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord." And look at these last two words. My salvation. David's beginning to get there. And the first thing he says is, Lord, in you I hope. He knows his only hope for salvation and restoration is in the Lord. And he expresses confidence there, you will hear, O Lord my God. At this point, it's not just please hear, it's I know you will hear. There's a confidence there. And then he talks about the prayer that he is offered to God, about those who are exalting themselves against him. And notice what he says in verses 17 and 18. I'm ready to fall. My sorrow is continually before me. David says, I'm helpless. But for your help, there's no way I can get out of this. He is in complete surrender mode. For, now watch this, I will declare my iniquity. What is it John says in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9? If we confess our sins, He, God the Father, is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. That's where David is. He's confessing his sins to the Father. I will declare my iniquity. I will be in anguish over my sin. What did Paul write to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians? Godly sorrow worketh repentance, not to be repented of. There he is again. David's getting there. He's beginning to take the steps that are necessary to deal with the sin so he can recuperate from the guilt of the sin. All right? But, he says, my enemies are vigorous and they are strong, and those who hate me wrongfully have multiplied. David realizes he's got a long way to go to get through this yet. There's a lot of adversaries against him. Those also who render evil for good, they are my adversaries, because I follow what is good. Now, think about this just a moment. The fact that David is grieving so deeply over his sin tells us something about the standard David set for himself, right? If he weren't committed to doing right, it wouldn't bother him that he had done wrong. It's the fact that he is so disappointed in himself for not having lived up to the standard that he had espoused and embraced that gives him so much problem now. And that's a big part of what his enemies are using against him. Look at him, he's a hypocrite. He preaches righteousness, but look what he's done. You see? And he's really grappling with that fact. And he's saying, I'm really struggling with that. But in the midst of all that, in verse 21, he says, do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, be not far from me. Now, I find it incredibly interesting that in that series of stories that Jesus tells in Luke 15, when he talks about sheep, the sheep didn't come home on its own. The shepherd went to the sheep. You remember that? Let me urge you, if you have a songbook at home, look up the song, The 90 and 9, because I think in poetry, that song especially beautifully describes what the shepherd went through to get to the sheep. Just sort of embellishing on that story. But in that particular parable, the shepherd goes to the sheep who is lost in the wilderness and caught in the briars and the brambles, and he goes and he disentangles the sheep, and remember, he lays that sheep on his shoulders and he carries him home. That's what David, the shepherd, is begging for right now. Come get me, come find me. I'm lost, I'm stuck in the briars, I'm hurt, I'm bleeding, and I need help. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. Man, are these powerful or what? Love these Psalms. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at 51 and 32 and see how David works his way through this to complete recovery. Thank you so much for your attention.